It is April 13th, 1942. The weather over Salisbury Plain is hazy, uncertain, the kind of English spring morning where the light seems trapped between cloud and earth. 6 Hawker Hurricanes from No. 79 Squadron RAF are climbing through the murk, their engines a percussion of industrial violence against the quiet of the Wiltshire countryside below. They are here for a firepower demonstration. They are here to show the assembled officers and dignitaries what modern air superiority looks like. They are here, quite unknowingly, to commit one of the war's most terrible acts of friendly fire. Below them, on the ground near the village of Imber, perhaps 200 soldiers and civilians have gathered. Some are officers, some are ground crew, some have come simply to witness British military prowess. The formation is textbook. The approach is controlled. Everything about this moment suggests precision, safety, the careful orchestration of a trained military machine at work. And then, in the haze, something goes catastrophically wrong. The first hurricane drops lower, its Browning machine guns thundering to life. The sound arrives first, a sound like tearing metal, like something fundamental being unmade, and then comes the realization. The bullets are not falling on the empty range target miles away. They are falling here. They are falling now. They are falling on the crowd. When it was over, 25 people were dead. 71 others lay wounded in the grass and the mud. A single moment of pilot error, of misjudgment and poor visibility, had turned a demonstration of Britain's fighting capability into a scene of carnage that would haunt Imber for the rest of its existence. But this tragedy, as shocking as it was, would prove to be merely a prelude. Within months, the entire village would be erased from the map. Within years, Imber would become a ghost, and the people who called it home would never see it again. To understand what happened to Imber is to understand something darker about the machinery of modern war, about the machinery of modern states. It is to understand how an entire community can be sacrificed not to enemy action, but to the practical demands of preparing to fight an enemy. It is to understand how promises can be made with the utmost sincerity and then systematically dishonored for nearly 80 years. Imber had existed as a settled place for more than 1,000 years. Its name appears in Domesday Book, that exhaustive catalogue of England made for the conqueror. By the 1930s, it was a small, unremarkable Wiltshire village, home to perhaps 150 souls. There was a post office. There was a pub called the Bell Inn. There was a Baptist chapel and St. Giles Church, a building of flint and stone that had stood since medieval times. There were farms, working farms that had sustained families through the agricultural depressions of the 19th century and the uncertain years of the 20th. There were children who went to the village school. There was, in short, ordinary English life, the kind of life that filled millions of small villages across the country. But Imber occupied a particular geography, and that geography would prove to be its undoing. It sat on Salisbury Plain, a vast plateau of chalk downland in Wiltshire that had been attracting military attention since the 19th century. The War Office had begun purchasing land there from the 1890s onwards. The plain was remote enough, elevated enough, empty enough to serve military purposes. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the Ministry of Defense controlled thousands of acres. By the time Hitler was beaten, it would control tens of thousands. The logic was straightforward. Britain needed to train soldiers. Britain needed to test weapons. Britain needed spaces where aircraft could practice bombing runs without destroying inhabited towns. Salisbury Plain, with its undulating grassland and its sparse population, seemed to offer all of this. The only complication was that it was not entirely uninhabited. There was Imber. There were other villages too, but Imber would become the symbol of what military necessity demanded. Through the 1930s and into the war years, the ministry's reach had extended incrementally. Residents of Imber, for the most part, had been left in place. They were there on sufferance, as it were, permitted to remain because wholesale evacuation seemed unnecessary. But as the war progressed, as the Americans arrived with the preparation for the Normandy landings, as the sheer volume of military activity on the plain intensified, this arrangement became untenable. The problem was straightforward. You could not train effectively if there were civilians in the way. You could not conduct large-scale bombardment exercises, tank maneuvers, artillery practice, if there were houses full of people who might be hit. The soldiers who came to the plain needed space. They needed safety of a sort. And the people of Imber, quite simply, were in the way. It was not malice that created this situation. It was merely the grinding logic of total war, the logic that says some people's lives must yield to larger purposes. In November 1943, the residents of Imber were gathered in the village school hall and informed that they had 47 days to leave their homes. They were told that this evacuation was temporary, a matter of military necessity for the duration of the war. They were told, with what appears to have been genuine sincerity, that they would be able to return once hostilities had ceased and Germany had been defeated. Some residents packed their belongings into boxes thinking they would unpack them elsewhere after a few years of absence. Some left items in kitchen cupboards, in wardrobes, small domestic things that seemed hardly worth the effort of transporting. These objects would remain undisturbed for decades. Some, perhaps, remain to this day. By Christmas 1943, Imber was empty. 152 people. That was the population figure from the 1931 census, though the actual number at evacuation was closer to 150, had left their homes. They dispersed across Wiltshire and beyond. Families that had lived there for generations were scattered. The school closed, the post office shut. The Bell Inn, that repository of village life, fell silent. What happened next was the slow, inexorable process by which a temporary measure becomes permanent. After the war ended in May 1945, residents waited to hear when they might return. Months passed. No word came. Years passed. Still nothing. The Ministry of Defense had other plans. The plane was useful. The infrastructure was in place. The buildings could serve as training facilities, as mock villages for urban warfare practice, as targets for whatever exercises the military could devise. The state had tasted the efficiency of having absolute control over that landscape, and it was not willing to relinquish it. A public inquiry was eventually held, decades later in fact, to determine whether Imber might be returned to its residents. The inquiry found in favor of the Ministry of Defense. The village would remain a military training area. The people would not return. The promises, sincere or otherwise, had become inoperative. They had been superseded by other considerations, by the grinding forward momentum of institutional processes, by the simple bureaucratic fact that it was easier to keep things as they were than to reverse them. Today, Imber is a ghost village. It exists as a sort of archaeological site, a place where the shells of buildings from the 1940s still stand amid the grass of Salisbury Plain. St. Giles Church remains, maintained by the church's Conservation Trust, opened once a year on the Saturday closest to St. Giles Day for a service of remembrance. The old Bell Inn is still there, its windows empty, its doors long gone. Council houses built in the 1930s stand in neat rows, their condition deteriorating with each passing season, their purpose long forgotten. Tank tracks scar the roads. Artillery shells have left their marks. The village that was promised would be temporary has become permanent in its abandonment. The Ministry of Defense allows public access to Imber on approximately 50 days each year. These are carefully controlled occasions, usually around the major holidays. Visitors can walk down the main street. They can stand in front of St. Giles Church and contemplate the medieval architecture. They can see the landscape that swallowed a community. But the vast majority of the plain remains off limits. Much of it is dangerous. Unexploded ordnance litters the ground. Shells that failed to detonate, bombs that buried themselves in the chalk, mines that were laid and never retrieved. Walking off the permitted paths could kill you. Only a handful of the original residents remain alive. Those who were children when they left have grown old elsewhere. They have raised children in other towns, other counties, other lives entirely. They speak of Imber with a mixture of fondness and bitterness. One former resident, Ken, was just 6 years old when he was evacuated. He is 96 now. He visits Imber on the open days when he can, walking the streets where he played as a child, looking at buildings that are slowly being consumed by weather and time. He is one of the last connections to the actual lived experience of that place. The tragedy of Imber is not, perhaps, as immediately dramatic as the friendly fire incident of 1942. It involves no sudden violence, no moment of catastrophic error. Instead, it involves something more insidious: the slow, deliberate destruction of a community through bureaucratic process. It involves the making of promises that are never kept. It involves the understanding that some people's lives matter less than the requirements of the state, and that once you have that understanding, there is no mechanism within the state apparatus to overturn it. The friendly fire incident had been an accident, a moment when human error and poor visibility conspired to transform a training exercise into tragedy. But there was no ambiguity about what happened that day. The fault was clear, the damage was visible. But the evacuation of Imber was different. It was carried out by the book with proper authority, following legal procedures. It was, in many ways, a perfectly ordinary exercise of state power. It was also, perhaps, one of the most complete erasures of a community ever carried out in modern Britain. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The algorithm is unforgiving, and each subscriber changes what we can create. Imber was not, of course, the only evacuation that took place on Salisbury Plain. The Ministry of Defense had also taken over other villages and hamlets. But Imber became the symbol because of its completeness, because of the way it embodied the logic of total war pushed to its logical conclusion. In Germany, the Nazis were clearing populations from areas they deemed strategically necessary. In Britain, the evacuation of Imber was carried out by a democratic government following democratic procedures. Perhaps that makes it more troubling, not less. The machinery of state power does not require dictatorship to function. It requires only a justification. Compared to other military requisitions of civilian land during the Second World War, Imber's evacuation stands out for its permanence. The Americans had also taken land, established bases, displaced communities. But many of those arrangements were explicitly temporary. Imber was meant to be temporary too. That it became permanent was not inevitable. It was a choice, made quietly, made bureaucratically, made so gradually that the opportunity to reverse it simply passed away. Each year that went by made return less likely. Each new facility built made it less practical. The temporary became the actual. Other nations experienced similar patterns. The Soviets evacuated entire populations from areas designated for military use. The Americans would do the same in the Pacific, removing people to make way for nuclear testing. But Imber remains distinctive because of the manner of its erasure. Not violent, not spectacular, but thorough. The village was not destroyed in a bombing raid. It was not wiped out by a military action. It was simply removed from the map, placed into a category of land that existed outside civilian life. What happened to Imber matters because it revealed something about the relationship between the state and its citizens during total war. It showed that this relationship could be recalibrated, that the ordinary protections and promises that bound people to government could be suspended in the name of larger purposes. It showed that military necessity, once invoked, could override almost anything else. And it showed that once such a precedent is established, reversing it becomes nearly impossible, no matter how arbitrary the original decision might have been. The legacy of Imber is written in the landscape itself. Walk the streets of the village on one of the designated open days, and you walk through a place that is, in a sense, suspended in time. The buildings have aged, certainly. The weather has taken its toll, but the essential configuration of the place, the arrangement of houses, the church at the center, the memory of community, remains visible. It is a palimpsest of abandonment, a place where you can read the history of displacement written in architecture and empty rooms. Some of the buildings that survived the evacuation were destroyed by later military use. Tanks ran over them. Explosions brought them down. But others have endured, maintained in a kind of limbo between preservation and decay. St. Giles Church has been carefully restored. The church's Conservation Trust invested over £300,000 in renovations. It is, in that sense, honored. But the honor is also a monument to loss, a well-maintained reminder of what is gone. There have been attempts to draw attention to Imber's case, to argue for the restoration of the village to civilian use. In 1961, 50 years after the evacuation, thousands of people marched to Imber in protest. They demanded that the village be returned. The Ministry of Defense was unmoved. The march is itself a historical footnote now, a moment when the original residents and their supporters made one last collective assertion of their claim. But the machinery of state moved on, indifferent. The question of what happened to Imber remains partly open. Why could a democratic government keep a village sealed off for so long? Why was the decision made in the first place? Why was it never reversed? Part of the answer lies in the nature of military land. Once a place becomes a military zone, a zone designated dangerous and off-limits, it acquires a certain legal and administrative gravity. It becomes difficult to undo. There are questions of unexploded ordnance, of infrastructure, of the simple fact that the military establishment, once entrenched, resists dissolution. But part of the answer also lies in something more troubling. Part of the answer lies in the fact that the people of Imber, dispersed across the country, never constituted a political force large enough to reverse what had been done to them. They were victims of their own smallness. Had there been 10,000 residents instead of 150, had Imber been a significant town rather than a small village, reversing the evacuation might have been politically possible. But for a small village, for scattered families, for people whose claims were historical rather than immediately urgent, the machinery of state could simply wait them out. Today, Imber exists as a kind of living museum to the demands of total war. It is a place where you can stand and think about what it means when the state decides that your home is needed for other purposes. It is a place where you can contemplate the promises that were made and the promises that were broken. It is a place where you can read, in the very absence of people, the presence of a state power that was willing to erase a community in the name of necessity. The people who lived there before the evacuation are nearly all gone now. The handful who remain are very old. They carry the memory of a place that no longer exists as home, that exists now only as a regulated archaeological site, as a training ground, as an absence. Their children grew up in other villages, other towns. They have no personal memory of Imber except what they were told by parents and grandparents. The place has become a story, and stories fade, but Imber itself remains. The village stands on Salisbury Plain still, its buildings weathering the seasons, its church maintained by volunteers and charity, its streets walked only by the military, and on the rare designated days, by tourists and descendants who have come to see what remains of home. It is a monument to many things, to the demands of military necessity, to the machinery of the modern state, to the way that the ordinary protections of civilian life can be suspended when deemed necessary, to the fact that promises made in desperation are sometimes simply broken. The friendly fire incident of 1942 killed 25 people. It was a tragedy, sudden and terrible. But in some ways, the evacuation of Imber that followed was a slower tragedy, drawn out across decades, affecting not just those killed in an instant, but entire families, entire generations, removing them from a place they had called home, and then, by degrees, making it impossible to return. The one was sudden. The other was systematic. Both were products of war, of the machinery of total war grinding forward, indifferent to the human cost. 80 years have passed since the residents of Imber were told they had 47 days to leave. No generation born after 1943 has lived there. No child has been born in Imber since the evacuation. No new memories have been made in those cottages and farmhouses except the memories of military personnel and tourists and descendants coming to pay their respects to what is lost. The village that was promised would be temporary has become the most permanent kind of memorial to impermanence, a place where time has stopped, where absence is the dominant feature of the landscape, where the machinery of the state still controls every stone. That is what remains of Imber today. Not a functioning village, not a ghost village, but something more troubling still, a monument to the way that ordinary communities can be erased, not through violence or spectacle, but through the quiet, inexorable forward momentum of bureaucratic process. It is a warning written in empty buildings, a reminder that the relationship between the state and its citizens is more fragile than we might like to believe, and that once a precedent is set, once it is established that some people's homes can be taken in the name of necessity, it becomes very difficult indeed to reverse it, no matter how much time passes, no matter how much is promised, no matter how much is owed. The grass grows over Imber now. The seasons turn. On certain days the gates are opened, and people walk through the village looking at what remains. On most days the military has it back, training soldiers, testing weapons, maintaining the readiness that the state has deemed necessary. Imber was a village once. Now it is something else entirely. A place where absence has a shape, where loss can be visited and contemplated, where the past reaches out to touch the present, but can never quite bridge the gap that was opened 80 years ago when the people of a small Wiltshire village were told to leave and never came home.